In these days, I encountered a true story, a tale of one overseas Chinese deceiving another, a lamentable tale of mutual harm. The story goes like this. There was an auntie from northwestern China, aged around 65, whom we'll call Annie. She exhausted various methods and spent a considerable amount of money to finally obtain a tourist visa to Australia. Her plan was, once in Australia, to convert it into a student visa or refugee visa and spend her remaining years here. Perhaps facing numerous hardships back home, she longed to escape to the Australia she had yearned for. However, having met and conversed with Annie before, I must admit her conduct and habits were far from commendable. She had adopted all the bad habits we often associate with aging badly: exaggeration, arrogance, rudeness, you name it. In her quest for employment, she found a job at a massage parlor in the western suburbs of Melbourne. At the same time, she found a landlord nearby, renting a room for $190 per week. After much ado, she finally rented a room in the western area for $190 per week. The landlord, a Shanghai native, shared the accommodation with two Malaysian and Chinese couples. He thought he could settle down here, work slowly, earn money, and prepare for retirement. However, things didn't go as planned. Perhaps due to a poor relationship with the landlord, or maybe the landlord didn't like him, or perhaps he was too contentious and angered the landlord. One day, he suddenly called from Australian Customs, claiming he was detained. Since the day he called to say he was detained by the Australian Immigration Bureau, everything seemed to come out of the blue. Why did he leave? Where did he go? It wasn't until we communicated during his detention at the Immigration Bureau that we learned the truth. Apparently, the landlord had told him, just buy a ticket to Indonesia and then return, and you'll become a permanent resident of Australia. This was a ludicrous lie. For someone like Annie, lacking knowledge and experience, perhaps she was filled with longing for this beautiful lie and believed it unquestioningly. So, she indeed bought a ticket. The landlord arranged to take her to the airport. She flew to Indonesia, and then was detained when she returned to Australia the same day. We only found out later that it was the landlord who orchestrated this scheme. At the time, we couldn't help but wonder why the landlord would deceive her in this way. It made no sense. Perhaps the landlord was also shallow-minded, right? We temporarily set aside this matter, and Annie could only wait to be repatriated to China, ending her dream of spending her remaining years in Australia. It was a sad ending for her. However, the story didn't end there. After returning to China, we arranged for friends to help her retrieve her luggage from the landlord. But we heard even more surprising news. On her way to the airport, the landlord had already packed her luggage and placed it in the garage. This indicated that the landlord had already planned for her not to return smoothly. From this deduction, the landlord wanted to frame her and drive her away. The reasons varied, perhaps due to my impression of this auntie, who was indeed someone not likable. But for the landlord to do such unreasonable things, just to get rid of a tenant he didn't like, was hard to understand. Later, Annie wanted to return the deposit and rent collected by the landlord, but the landlord refused to refund her, citing special items in her luggage. These special items obviously referred to those used for illegal professions. The landlord threatened to report her, and thus refused to refund her. The story ends here, a tragic tale and a despicable example of overseas Chinese tarnishing their own image.